Good evening, everyone.
Hello.
Just want to make sure that I can hear you. Go ahead and be unmuted for a moment if you'd like.
I'll unmute, but I got nothing to say.
That's okay, Leah, thank you.
I'm with you.
Just testing the audio. Okay, fantastic. Good evening, friends.
Good evening.
Thank you so much for making time to be with us for the second of our 3 sessions on our preparation for high holidays. Does anyone know I'm Rabbi Shana from Congregation near Tamid? Truly grateful that you're here. So we had a request to record tonight's session and next week's. So that was my very brief delay. I just wanted to make sure also that the recording was working. So just to let everyone know that that is already in progress. And tonight we have the subject of Zichronot, which will translate for tonight as remembrance or memorial. And it is the second of the 3 primary themes of the Rosh Hashanah Musaf service. The first being Malchuyot, sovereignty or kingship, that Rabbi Katie did so expertly last week as our introduction. The second is Zichronot, verses of remembrance. And the third is Shofarot, which Rabbi Sammy will tackle next week in a session that looks at the effect of the Shofar on our souls. I will admit, and I won't ask anyone else to admit this, but I will on behalf of the girl I used to be, that the Musaf service of Rosh Hashanah is lengthy in a traditional setting, and it can be a little easy to perhaps think of other things or be counting the minutes until the shofar comes. Though the services on Shabbat are beautiful, in traditional settings, the shofar is not blown on Shabbat. When this coincides with Rosh Hashanah, that first day feels a little bit like there's something missing. So we had that last year. A second day to hear the shofar was a treat, but it can feel rather lengthy and even a little bit burdensome. We won't tell the
I don't know yet.
But they did very, very well and wanted to share as many verses from the tradition as they could to illuminate or elucidate those great themes on which they had decided. So for this evening, let's just take a second. And I'm going to bring up a few slides to share. Let's try it again. To begin this evening with some words of Abraham Joshua Heschel. The authentic individual is neither an end nor a beginning, but a link between ages, both memory and expectation. To us, recollection is a holy act. We sanctify the present by remembering the past. To us Jews, the essence of faith is memory. To believe is to remember. To believe is to remember. Rabbi Heschel wrote with such a magnificent flair and depth. And I'm with him on much of this opening statement. But I will confess that much of the last couple of days, when I came across this beautiful quote, I've been turning over the notion of what he means by to believe is to remember. So I'm just going to let that float out there. May or may not have some comments on that, but just to take that in for a moment in his beautiful prose, to believe is to remember. Because the nature of memory is a bit slippery. And yet these verses of remembrance, the experience of memory, is central and profound to the Jewish experience. So let's just hold on to his notion of to believe is to remember. And in a moment, I'm just going to ask you all to please just relax and listen to this little piece by Debbie Friedman of blessed memory, basing her prayer on Psalm 27, the psalm for this season of repentance. She asks the Holy One to remember her for healing. Let's just take a couple of minutes to breathe in the evening. And as you listen to her melody, just meditate quietly on the question, for what would you ask to be remembered during this holiday season? And by whom?
Don't hide your face from me. I'm asking for your help. I call to you. Please hear my prayers, oh God. If you would answer me as I have called to you, please heal me now. Don't hide your face from me. If you would answer me as I have called to you, please heal me now. Don't hide your face from me. Don't hide your face from me. I'm asking for your help. I call to you, please hear my prayers, oh God. If you would answer me as I have called to you, please heal me now. Don't hide your face from me. If you would answer me as I have called to you, please heal me now. Don't hide your face from me. Please heal me now. Don't hide your face from me.
Memory is absolutely central to the Rosh Hashanah liturgy and to the Jewish experience. Would anyone like to just take a gander at what Rabbi Heschel might have meant by to believe is to remember? Share for a second. To believe is to remember. What does he mean by that? Just no wrong answer, because I'm not sure 1000% what he meant. Just something to take in. Anyone want to take a guess at what that could mean?
Rabbi,
Yeah, David.
so much of our relationship with God is bound up in what is supposed to be our collective national memory from the Exodus or before onward. as we relive it through our ritual.
Anyone else agree or disagree with Heschel? To believe is to remember. I often find myself spinning with Heschel in a good way.
I think maybe he's talking about and the gentleman who just spoke, David, is referring to the study of the Torah, because that's how we remember. If we study the Torah, we remember the history. And if you're remembering the history, then you're believing because you're practicing a part of, Judaism. So.
Thank you, Narissa. Beautiful. It's a wonderful concept, isn't it?
I think it's backwards.
Yeah, I sort of thought that too. Was that Hannah?
No, that was your mother.
Oh, hi, Mommy.
That's okay now. I should have raised my hand, but it just occurred to me that it is. I think Rabbi Heschel might have wanted to turn that around. To remember is to believe, which really ties in with what David was saying. As that's how we validate and verify everything we believe in is, we remember it.
I guess the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, because it's thought similar, that it almost feels like it ought to be to remember, like leads to belief. But I imagine that Rabbi Heschel was quite deliberate in his choice of word order, that to believe is to remember. I'm spinning with that wonderful concept. If anyone else would like to jump in on it, wonderful. If it's mystifying, I'm right there with you.
I think it said, if to believe is to remember means more to you than the other way around, to remember is to believe. I think the way he put it says a lot about him and his world and his practicing of his faith and his, the way he was in the world from the little bit I know about him. But for me, it works better the other way around too, but that says more about who I am in my time, in my life, and belief is much less important to me. But I think for him, that was primary. That's what drove him to all the great work that he did.
There's also, I wonder if there's, to believe, what does that mean? To believe what? What is believe? And so we're all working on certain assumptions that I guess come from where we're coming from too.
Indeed.
I would say that.
Oh, please, Tom. Hi, Tom.
I would say that if we're looking at what Heschel is saying, I think what I see or hear in that is to believe is to remember. He's really talking about relationship. Mm-hmm. And that's what I think is part of why he may put it that way. The relationship of God to people, whether it be the Jewish people or whatever, but and what happened in that relationship or what happens in that relationship.
Rabbi, I think it's because we study the Torah every single day, and it's important for us to not forget what happened to our ancestors. And so every Rosh Hashanah, we're reliving what happened to our ancestors. Every time we go to the synagogue, we're reliving. So that's his way of saying it's important not to remember, to forget what happened with our ancestors and the Torah and the Bible.
Thank you, Rita. Now, I'm going to take that as a segue into the next chapter of our conversation this evening. But I'm so grateful to all of you for taking such a wonderful bite out of Heschel's beautiful notions. Let's just kind of hold on to that for a little bit. The beautiful dance that belief, and you're right, Hannah, it can take many facets, what we mean by belief, and the notion of remembering and how they dance and relate to one another. Oops. Wonderful. Okay. Let's take a look at Leviticus 23, verse 24. This is the biblical source for referring to Rosh Hashanah, which got its name officially during the Talmudic era, as Yom HaZikaron, Day of Remembrance or Memorial Day, which is a little bit surprising, even though we have memory and these themes of Zichronot running through so much of the liturgy of Rosh Hashanah. But Yom HaZikaron likely associate with the day we more generally refer to, Yom HaZikaron in our modern era, as Israel's Memorial Day. But long ago, this was the basis for referring to Rosh Hashanah as a day of remembrance. And I deliberately left it up here untranslated. I'll just read it in Hebrew first so we can hear that where Zichron comes. Daber el b'nei Yisrael lemor, b'chodesh hashvi'i be'echad lachodesh, yihyeh lachem. Thus far, it's fairly straightforward. Say to the children of Israel, or speak to the children of Israel, saying, in the 7th month, that wasn't so easy because the calendar of the Jewish people requires an advanced degree in math, but we'll take, as we've come to accept, the 1st month of the year as Nisan. The 7th month is Tishrei, about to be upon us. In the 7th month, be'echad lachodesh, on the 1st day of the month, there will be for you Shabbaton, Zichron, Teruah, Mikra, Kodesh. I'm going to read you Art Scroll's translation. They tend, in my experience, to be generally closest to what's considered the literal translation. They translate this verse as, there shall be a rest day for you, a remembrance with shofar blasts.
Oh.
A remembrance with shofar blasts. Just to make life interesting, I'm going to see if I can find a few more translations. I'm going to read them to you because a little bit of a vortex. Here are a couple of other options. On the 1st day of the 7th month, you are to have a day of Sabbath rest, a sacred assembly commemorated by trumpet blasts. Observe a day of complete rest. It will be an official day for holy assembly, a memorial proclaimed with blasts of trumpets, a sacred assembly announced by trumpet blasts, a memorial of blowing trumpets, a holy convocation, a reminder by blowing trumpets, a memorial day announced by the blowing of trumpets, a day of complete rest, commemoration, and trumpet blasts. And my friends, that's just a few of the offerings across numerous translations of the Torah in various traditions, all grappling with this idea of zichron. So it's anything but simple what this day of remembrance is supposed to suggest. Seems to be intricately related to the idea of the blowing of the shofar, but in some translations, that's separated out. A day of rest, commemoration, and trumpet blasts, a sacred assembly. Not sure if I see a couple people grabbing grabbing their own translations. But given that this is the only mention of, quote, Rosh Hashanah, or the day that became known as Rosh Hashanah, actually Rosh Hashanah as a phrase appears only once in the entire Hebrew Bible, in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 40, verse 1, where he speaks sort of generally of this at the time of the start of the year. And then he goes on to specifically speak about Yom Kippur, which was the start of the Jubilee year. So it's not at all clear to what Ezekiel is referring. He doesn't seem to be referring to the first day of the month of Tishrei. So that's the only place that those words Rosh Hashanah appear together in the entire Bible. But the Talmud rabbis, building on this day, use just that one vague and rather slippery reference to remembrance as intimately connected to this Shabbaton, this great Sabbath, which I think is kind of marvelous because the nature of memory itself is slippery, isn't it? It's so fundamental to our being and our peopleness. If we take Heschel at his word, and I think most of us would, we are suffused with memorial traditions. We are always remembering, as Rita said beautifully. You all spoke so beautifully, thank you, but particularly remembering the relationship with our ancestors and the experience of our ancestors as our stories have been passed down to us. And yet memory itself is this elusive, marvelous concept, such that each of us will likely even remember this evening very differently, depending on where we were sitting and how we were hearing this. So as fundamental as it is, it's hard to wrap ourselves around. And given that that's the one reference to remembrance related to this beginning of the new year, it just gives me pause. So taking it a little bit at its face value, just let us weigh in for a couple of minutes on what connections do you make, just free associating between Rosh Hashanah and remembering. Rosh Hashanah and remembering, how do they connect for you? Anyone have any memories associated with Rosh Hashanah?
I remember one of my earliest Rosh Hashanah was in Beit David in St. Paul, Minnesota. I was sitting next to my father. My mother and grandmother were sitting in the back. There was a rail and all the women were in the back. And I remember the experience because it's something that's stuck in my brain. And that was well over, gosh, it must have been close to 75 years ago. And there have been other Rosh Hashanah, more recent ones. And I find that I have this vague recollection in my brain. And I find that what I experience today somehow evolves from those earlier experiences. It didn't just happen today. It's been a continuing, ongoing experience.
So, exactly. Thank you so much. Because I think for so many people, the notion of memory and Rosh Hashanah, it's personal memory.
Yes.
Childhood memories or just earlier Rosh Hashanahs, maybe the first Rosh Hashanah we experienced as part of the Jewish people. Or as you say, I'm sorry, do you go by Isidore, forgive me, or is he?
It's fine, thank you, Rabbi.
Is a family memory, the feeling of being, if we were fortunate, embraced as children in the spirit of Rosh Hashanah. Anyone else have a different association? Connects Rosh Hashanah with memory in another way? Or the same way?
I can say something.
Please.
Almost every year, I go to services, and usually I'm preoccupied by life and feeling busy, and oh my God, it's here again already, and I gotta get to services. And then I sit in the service and I hear music, I hear the rabbi, and then memories start flooding of things that have happened that maybe within the last year, or maybe just very recently. And it always seems to take me by surprise, the way the memories hit me. And sometimes they're very, very powerful, and I shed a tear, but in ways that make me very grateful. It's always a real feeling of gratitude that I can do this. And I always feel like, I guess I needed this.
Nice. Thank you. This is a little bit like riding a bicycle and the best feeling of it. Once you come back into it, it's natural, but it's also a reminder of other times. Sort of remember how to do this once we start. A little bit. You said it much more profoundly just now. That was.
Oh, thank you.
But needing to remember how to be in the zone, as it were, the high holiday place.
Yeah.
What it takes to get there.
Mm-hmm.
I would imagine last year and this will be high holiday seasons that we will not likely forget in our times.
Mm-hmm.
May our days be long.
It's also for me, there's the melodies and the music that sets me in place or something. Yeah. And the shofar, the sound of the shofar. This is the time of the year that we do that.
Yes, indeed, Ohana, thank you. Remembering the sounds that are particular to this season. You strike some very deep chords. Despite all of our words, it's often the melody. Lie, la, lie, 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 and then suddenly comes flooding in. And that moment of piercing the soul. I'll give a little prelude to next week, where it all falls away and it's just the shofar. Talk about a memory. And we'll hold on to the shofar as a symbol, because it is from there really that the liturgists ultimately created the core of the Zichronot experience in the Musaf. So just hang on to that idea of the shofar and that symbol there. Denise?
Talk about something coming out of almost nowhere. I grew up as probably one of the more typical San Francisco Jews. We recognized very little of our tradition, but Rosh Hashanah, I was not allowed to go to school, nor Yom Kippur. And I remember my grandmother cooking a wonderful meal for Rosh Hashanah. I don't think it was always the same, but she was a wonderful cook, much better than my mother. My mother was the first to acknowledge that. But my grandmother just, she made, she baked and cooked and soups, her soups were fabulous. And I think the tastes, those were probably my first real tastes of being Jewish. And as I say, we were not a family that celebrated any holidays except those two. And of course, I didn't have to go to school. So what child doesn't remember getting to sleep in and stay home? But I guess Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur stamped me and stamped for me the fact that I was Jewish in ways I really can't think of anything else. That was it, until
sense memories.
Yes,
seem to be coming up, right? The sounds, the tastes, right? Maybe some of the smells.
Mm.
the sights. Beautiful. So sense memory, very, very powerful. Thank you so much. So memory and Rosh Hashanah are integrally bound up in one another, particularly in the liturgy, which is our task to consider just a little bit more of. We may have some other beautiful memories that come. We'll come back to that too if we have a little bit of time. Let me make sure that I'm on schedule. Okay. So we remember as students, or no matter how old we are, children of this tradition. And starting with Heschel, it seems, at least by his beautiful reckoning, to be somehow connected to our sense of believing, whether in God or in the lessons of the tradition or just in the inherent worth of this way of life. There may be many things in which we believe. But in this magnificent Lev Shalem Machzor from the conservative movement, this is part of a longer teaching, but David Kramer suggests that it is in the Bible where God is described as remembering far more often than humans. So memory thus becomes a divine quality, representing the ability to overcome the limitations of a particular time, to see the part as one segment of a far greater whole. I love that description of memory as a divine quality. Let's just sit with that for a moment. Since it is the divine presence filtered through all of the emanations of the Kabbalah, that's our approach to this. But God in the Bible, remembering far more often than humans. I just love that notion. A divine quality representing the ability to overcome the limitations of a particular time, to see the part as one segment of a far greater whole. Just leave that up for a second. This suggests that when we as human beings remember, we are somehow acting in God's image, B'Tselem Elohim. Or to use the Latin, we are engaging in imitatio Dei, an imitation of the divine. Different way to think about memory, perhaps. But a little deeper dive into the stories that we read on Rosh Hashanah, particularly, suddenly that's not a very big leap anymore. The Torah reading on Rosh Hashanah is occasion for endless numbers of sermons and discussions. It doesn't seem to match up right away with this notion of the birthday of the world. And there are communities that choose instead to read on Rosh Hashanah from Genesis. If we're celebrating Hayom Harat Olam, which kind of means today the world is pregnant, but usually translates as today is the birthday of the world. And if it is, then why are we reading about Sarah? So much ink and vocal cords have been devoted to thinking about that notion. But here at the beginning of our Torah reading, the traditional Torah reading from Genesis 21 is Vadonai pakad et Sarah. Also translated a number of ways, but in many translations, God remembered Sarah. The Torah reading itself begins with an act of remembrance. Often translated, God took note of Sarah. The choice there is defended as taking note is an active memory. You don't just remember it inside, you do something about it. God had made a promise that Sarah would bear a child. And we begin Rosh Hashanah Torah reading with reminding of how that promise was fulfilled. So the Torah begins with an act of memory. And it'll end with one as well. But even more to the literal wording is the Haftarah from day one. The Haftarah reading for the first day of Rosh Hashanah is from the book of Samuel. And there we have the story of Hannah, who, like Sarah, is also childless and suffering as a result. And right in the middle of that magnificent Haftarah, we have Elkanah knew his wife Hannah, Vayizkereha Adonai, and God remembered her. Suddenly, as I lit on that connection, the Zichronot section came alive for me in a different way. This entire experience and the choices of the rabbis are directing us toward consideration of what it means to feel and be remembered. How we take the story, the legend, literally or not, those that wrote it wanted us, the readers, to feel hope that we might yet be remembered. And in Debbie's song, that's what she's asking for. Please remember me. Don't abandon me. Don't turn away from me. Whether she's speaking to God, a loved one. Never. We don't want to be abandoned. We want to be remembered. And Sarah and Hannah really live those moments for us cathartically on day one. And then, as if that weren't quite enough, day two, the traditional reading, is the binding of Isaac. And that's where memory really comes into play yet again. It is a painful piece picking up from day one, where it seems that actually it's Sarah who remembers God's promise that though Ishmael would be a great nation, it would be Isaac who particularly carried on Abraham's line as the promise is made. And Abraham is undone at Ishmael's banishment, but Sarah stays the course, painful as that is. She seems to remember God's promise. And then on the second day, God puts Abraham to the test and directs the binding of Isaac. And it's this binding of Isaac that seems to ultimately capture the liturgist's attention. There are multiple biblical verses. The rabbis of the Talmud had a great dispute how many verses for each theme should be included, kind of settled on 10, and many traditional prayer books or machzorim, but that was up for a lot of dispute, as usual. These gorgeous meditations on Zichronot and these verses from the Bible ultimately combine in this rather thunderous pronouncement where all of these notions of memory and God remembering and it all coming together in this moment of the binding of Isaac, suddenly that's on stage. Let me see if I've done that correctly. Okay. This is the conclusion of the Zichronot section. You have always remembered that which has been forgotten, for there is no forgetting in your realm. So on this day, in your great mercy, remember the binding of Isaac for the sake of his descendants. Praised are you, God, who remembers the covenant. Tekiah. Wow. It's barely 2.5 lines in the Hebrew. But my gosh, what a punch this beating heart of the Musaf Amidah packs. You, O God, have always remembered that which has been forgotten. What on earth does that mean? It's a theme that repeats quite a bit in the Unatane Tokef, in the great prayers in front of the ark, describing the metaphor of the Jewish people as members of a flock, going before the Holy One, hoping to be renewed for a new year, or at least for goodness and life, for however long we have it. And in that, those brilliant chanted prayers from the Middle Ages, there is this repeating motif. Oh God, you don't forget anything. Even in the act of remembering and the description of God remembering far more than human beings, there is always, of course, the sense that God has not forgotten anything. And even when we have forgotten, the Holy One remembers. Talk about a pregnant moment, which is the language that appears right on the other side of the shofar blowing. Today is the birthday of the world, or today the world stands as at birth, or today the world is pregnant with possibility. Binding of Isaac as the moment in that great history that many of you were speaking about before, that we are holding at that moment, that absolute centerpiece, the center of the center of the Musaf. These verses of remembrance all combine into this moment of the binding of Isaac. Surprising? Does it work? What do you think?
Is this saying that, at the moment of the knife in the air, God comes down and says, nope, don't do that. And that's what we are to remember, that as the saving of the Jewish, the Jewish people. Is that what?
In my mind, it's a demonstration of Abraham's faith in God, that when God spoke, he followed to the letter. That's what God remembers, and because of that remembrance, we remember that the dedication and loyalty and listening to God's word implicitly.
Yeah.
It invites some thought, doesn't it? That is the moment they chose to crescendo into the shofar blowing.
Well, it's like, don't you forget, God, what Isaac did, what he was willing to do for you. So
Abraham.
you got to remember us now. Remember Isaac.
Little quid pro quo here. Little tit for tat. That moment when Abraham raises his knife and God calls it off. It's called in many scholarship circles the great moment of, certainly of liturgical history, when even the whisper of human sacrifice was relegated to history for the Jewish people. That confusion, whether Abraham voices it or not, of is this what God wants? And his willingness, despite all of our missteps and forgetfulness, it binds together in this moment where the Chazan, the cantor, on behalf of us all, beseeches God. Please do not forget in your great mercy the binding of Isaac, and how bound up we are in these memories, how intimately connected we are with our conception of the Holy One, who invites us to rise up and remember our history on this day. And then with that image of the binding of Isaac, there are many other verses. Don't think they forgot the Exodus totally. That's right above. But that's a little more quotidian almost. No disrespect to the Exodus. But we're accustomed to reliving the Exodus in Mi Chamocha. But not as much the binding of Isaac. But on this day, on the day of the Truah, this day of Zichron Truah, remembrance with the shofar, commemoration and the shofar. Hebrew's wonderfully vague in that regard. So many possibilities. But that connection of remembrance and the shofar would follow, literarily speaking, that there would be a link between that moment of the binding of Isaac and the ram caught in the thicket, that we are bidden to remember when the shofar is blown. And though this is a year for me trying new things, blowing the shofar, I'm sorry, is not one of them. I can't seem to get the right pressure to get a sound out of it. So we'll just have to imagine it.
Is there some connection to or at least maybe there is in my mind right now, to this story and this concept of don't forget. But during this time, as we're approaching Yom Kippur, we are spiritually in the year at our most vulnerable and exposing everything. We are recalling things that are painful and admitting wrong and admitting it's time to turn again, once again. And I seem to keep forgetting, and here I am again, and I'm remembering again, but I'm asking you, God, to please not forget me during this time of my greatest vulnerability, as I admit so many things that I need to do differently.
Oh, that's fantastic, Patty. Thank you. Right? Are we not considered at our most vulnerable at this time? Bound on the altar of tradition with our fate hanging in the air? Like Isaac himself? Oof. How about stepping into Isaac's shoes? That's something to remember. Oh my gosh, thank you. Absolutely. Our fate hangs in the balance, says our liturgy at this time of year. Are we not like Isaac himself?
I remember when I was at the Rosh Hashanah service and I needed to go to work because my boss needed me, and I felt guilty for leaving the service. But when I went to work, my boss was very grateful that I came, and she was very understanding. And so, yeah, it meant a lot to me. It meant a lot to me. Even though there was a break, I still felt guilty about leaving, but it meant a lot to me knowing that she understands that it's important for me to be at the service, but she needs me too. So she was grateful that I was able to work at least half the day. So yeah, it meant a lot to me.
Oh, that's wonderful. And rare, I'm afraid, but something absolutely for which to be grateful. And we each act as a sacrifice. I mean, to attend services, particularly if we're needed at work and we live in a secular world, it is a sacrifice that we would like maybe to have remembered somewhere by someone. I myself think of the word sacrifice in its relation to sacred, something that we set apart and offer for holy good. Sacrifice has that sort of unpleasant connotation of giving up something. But if you think of giving up as in offering something up, it takes on a whole different meaning.
Well, I lost that job because of COVID, but now I work at a Jewish school on call. So for Jewish holidays, the school is closed. So I'm actually able to attend the services. I hope they start calling me in after summer break. But yeah, I'm like really grateful even though it's on call and they don't call me in, I'm just grateful that I have the opportunity to stay home and attend services on Jewish holidays. So I work for a Jewish school that actually celebrates Jewish holidays.
Oh, that's wonderful. There is something to be said about that. Jewish professionals who at least maybe can hope for some of those days off. It's not easy, but it is a beautiful sacrifice. So we're asking here in this barely, I didn't count how many words, but it can't be more than 25 Hebrew words, I don't think. It kind of encapsulates the entire experience, this ineffable notion of God remembering what we have forgotten, keeping a good memory bank for us, that everything is recorded in the heavenly realm. It's beautiful poetry, however we conceive of that. And then something as earthy and as terrifying as the binding of Isaac. And then that memory of the covenant. Praised are you, God, who remembers the covenant. And present tense, which is always powerful when the liturgists refer to things happening in this moment. They do that on purpose. Zocher habrit, the one who remembers the covenant. They do it with the traditional Torah reading blessings. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah. Praised is the Holy One who gives the Torah. Because by using the present tense, which is actually kind of difficult to get ourselves around, back to Heschel at the beginning, we're always either in the process of remembering or becoming something new. There is no holding to this moment. But the use of the present tense suggests in this moment, as we are remembering our history ourselves, our faith, our belief is ideally that God remembers as well. Not remembered back then, not even the hope that the covenant will be remembered, but zocher habrit, remembered in this very moment. Ilu, as though by saying it, we speak it into being. At least that is our prayer. I always think of the idea of remembering a little bit like pulling myself back together. We think of members sort of as arms and legs and parts of our body. So easy to feel unglued. The hope certainly of our ancestors was that these times of celebration would help us feel remembered. Again, a member of a community, family, a people. And it takes remembering to a little bit of a different place. So when we come to Zichronot, this vague notion in the Torah that this is a day that has something to do with remembering something, the Talmud rabbis and the liturgists later took that notion and ran with it. And we are still developing our meditations and poetry around the idea of memory. There are the verses from Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Psalms, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, that make up the traditional verses. And there are medieval, what we call piyutim, gorgeous liturgical poetry that can be a little bit flowery, because that was kind of its mandate. And then there are modern pieces that tie all of that together and take this glorious notion of what it means to be remembered, to hope to remember ourselves. And I'm indebted, though they didn't give an author for this piece. This is also from the Lev Shalem, and I'd like to just move us toward wrapping up with this. I just love this piece. I'll just invite you. Actually, Sarah Lee, would you like to read it?
You hear me?
Yeah.
As you remembered Noah, and with the wind dispersed the waters of the flood, so to remember us upon the flood of cruelty that threatens this frail ark, our world, and send the spirit of your care and goodness to calm the sea. As in Egypt, you heard our cries and remembered there your pact, with Abraham and Sarah, Yitzchak, Rivka, Yaakov, Rachel, and Leah. So too remember us, enslaved to our ways of living that we dare not change, oppressed by fears of pharaohs who turn living waters into blood. As you instructed Jeremiah, Yirmiyahu, whisper in the ear of Yerushalayim, how I remember your youthful passion, so to remember now to whisper in her ear again the words and acts that will establish justice, mercy, and peace.
Mm. Thank you, Sam.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you for asking me to read.
Is this not for that which we pray every day? And not just with the sense that it will one day just fall out of the sky like manna upon us, but to somehow find our way through the flood of cruelty in this fragile ark, to release us from the chains that enslave us and so many others, our ways of living that we dare not change. Oh. And pharaohs who turn living waters into blood. Suddenly, though this little meditation doesn't make specific mention of Abraham and Isaac at Mount Moriah, it's a stand-in, it's a snapshot of so much of our biblical history right here, doing exactly as the Talmudic rabbis asked us to do, to remember those times, those stories where the Holy One remembered, didn't forget us. And yet we are bidden at the same time to remember them as well. And when we do, perhaps we reaffirm our belief in this way of life. And however we conceive of the great sovereign who rules over the cosmos, and that to that divine hand and only that divine hand are we subject. When we remember this history, we declare a kind of belief. So maybe to believe is to remember, because without memory, in what do we believe? And do we not, no matter where we are, no matter the denomination, no matter the time or place, pray to hear the inspiration, to have our ear be caressed again, to hear the melodies of the cantor and the sound of the shofar and the words and directives in the Rosh Hashanah liturgy that can lead us to some measure of justice, mercy toward one another, and peace on our earth.
Amen.
Wouldn't that be something?
Mm.
So I'll invite you to do one more thing, and I'm happy to take some additional comments, please. It is taught that the broken pieces of the first set of tablets of the law were carried in the Holy Ark. We carry all of the pieces of ourselves and our past with us as we go. I would wish that the memory of our experiences as individuals and collectively as a Jewish people lead us forward into a sweet and hopeful new year. You might want to take a minute to just, it's very personal, so these would not be things perhaps to share too openly, but what broken pieces do we carry with us all the time? We are a collection of our memories, our experiences. What do we take with us and what can we soothe? What do we take comfort in remembering? And what might be too painful to recall, but nonetheless lives in our soul memory, all parts of who we are. May we bring those pieces, those wonderful broken pieces, to our Rosh Hashanah experience, inspired by the verses of kingship and prepared in our collective memory of the past to listen to the shofar that will beckon us forward into the future. I thank you so much for remembering with me tonight.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was
Thank you,
beautiful.
Rabbi.
Yeah,
Thank you.
beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much,
you.
Rabbi Shana.
I'll make just a tiny public service announcement. Speaking of tastes, on Sunday at 4, Ner Tamid is having a little recipe share and exchange. Come and share your favorite tastes and memories or recipes that you would be willing to share or tell us about. That's Sunday at 4. We're calling it Tea Time and Recipe Share. I'm sure I will need iced tea, but I'm hoping that many of you would have a hot tea or another hot drink. So just tea time, 4 o'clock on Sunday afternoon. This Saturday evening, Ner Tamid and Beth Orr of Studio City are presenting a Zichronot experience with beautiful music and prayers and meditations. That's Saturday evening at 7:30. I went backwards. I'm sorry, the recipe shares. Of course, next Tuesday evening with Rabbi Sammy, he'll bring our Elul series to a close. And I don't have to tell you, very soon after that is Rosh Hashanah. Shana Tova, my friends. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so
Thank
much.
you. Thank you. Toda Rabah.